Welcome, friend, to this gentle journey through the corridors of power, where ambition wore silken crowns were won with wit rather than warfare. Tonight, we explore the extraordinary life of Marie de Medici, a woman whose story intertwines with the fate of France itself during one of history's most turbulent periods. Whether you're settling in for the evening or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with history's most fascinating figures. If these peaceful historical narratives bring you comfort, consider subscribing as we have many more stories to share in the quiet hours ahead. This isn't some romanticized tale from a period drama. This was the reality of Renaissance Europe, where a young Italian woman would rise to become one of France's most powerful rulers, navigating deadly court intrigue and international politics with a skill that would make modern diplomats envious. Have you ever wondered how a foreign princess could arrive in a hostile court and not merely survive, but ultimately control an entire kingdom? The answer lies in understanding Marie de Medici's remarkable journey from Florentine nobility to French regent, a transformation that would reshape European politics for generations to come. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about women's roles in Renaissance society. Marie wasn't simply a queen who happened to hold power during a regency. She was a master strategist who understood that survival in the French court required more than royal blood. It demanded intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions of those around her before they understood them themselves. Today, I'm going to take you inside the private world of a woman who wielded absolute power while maintaining the facade of feminine propriety that her era demanded. You'll discover how she built networks of loyalty that spanned continents, manipulated religious conflicts for political advantage, and created artistic legacies that still inspire wonder today. By the end of our journey together, you'll understand why Marie de Medici represents the pinnacle of political sophistication in an age when women were supposed to be silent ornaments in their husbands' courts. But before we witness her transformation into one of Europe's most formidable rulers, let me paint you the world she was born into and the forces that would shape her destiny. The year was 1575, when Marie de Medici drew her first breath in the Palazzo Pitti, that magnificent fortress of Renaissance power that dominated the Florentine skyline. The very air she breathed was thick with the scent of ambition and the subtle perfumes that masked the ever-present threat of poison. A reminder that in the Medici household, beauty and danger walked hand in hand through marble corridors lined with priceless art. Her morning routine began before dawn, in apartments that would have dazzled even the most sophisticated European courts. Marie would wake to the gentle sounds of servants moving through chambers decorated with tapestries that told stories of Medici triumphs, their golden threads catching the first light filtering through windows that overlooked gardens where every flower had been chosen for its symbolic meaning. The very walls around her whispered of power, adorned with portraits of ancestors who had transformed themselves from merchants into princes through sheer force of will and careful political calculation. As she emerged from sleep in her bed, draped with silks that had travelled from the furthest reaches of the known world, Marie would find her ladies-in-waiting already preparing the elaborate ritual that would transform her from a sleeping child into a living representation of Medici authority. These weren't simple servants, but daughters of noble families who had been carefully selected for their intelligence and loyalty, each one a potential ally or enemy depending on the shifting currents of court politics that even young Marie was learning to navigate. The process of dressing alone was a masterclass in political theatre. Every garment was chosen not merely for its beauty, but for the message it would send to the dozens of courtiers, diplomats, and petitioners who would observe her throughout the day. Her chemise, made from linen so fine it seemed to have been woven from moonbeams, represented the purity expected of a Medici daughter. Over this came layers of silk and velvet in colors that had been selected by advisors who understood that fashion was simply diplomacy conducted through fabric. The pearls that adorned her throat came from waters controlled by Spanish fleets, their very presence a reminder of the complex web of alliances and rivalries that connected Florence to the broader European political landscape. Her jewels weren't ornaments, but statements. Each precious stone carefully chosen to communicate her family's wealth, taste, and international connections to anyone sophisticated enough to read such signals. But perhaps most remarkable was Marie's education, conducted in private chambers, where she would spend hours each day absorbing knowledge that most women of her era would never encounter. Her tutors weren't simple scholars, but internationally renowned intellectuals who had been recruited specifically to prepare her for a role that extended far beyond the traditional expectations of noble wives and mothers. In the morning hours, she would practice languages with native speakers who had been brought to Florence specifically for this purpose. Her French lessons were conducted by poets and diplomats who could teach her not merely vocabulary and grammar, but the subtle art of court conversation, where a single misplaced word could trigger international incidents. She mastered Latin with scholars who understood that access to classical learning was essential for anyone who hoped to participate in the intellectual debates that shaped European politics. Her afternoons were devoted to more practical arts that would prove invaluable in her future role as a ruler. She learned to read financial documents with Medici bank officials who explained how money flowed between nations and how economic pressure could be applied more effectively than military force. She studied maps with explorers and merchants who described distant lands and their resources, building the geographical knowledge that would later inform her foreign policy decisions. Music and dancing weren't merely cultural accomplishments, but essential diplomatic tools. Marie learned to play instruments and perform dances from across Europe, understanding that shared cultural experiences could create bonds between nations that formal treaties could never achieve. When she danced, she was practicing the art of reading body language and social dynamics that would serve her well in environments where spoken words often conveyed less truth than subtle gestures and meaningful glances. The evenings brought perhaps the most crucial education of all, as Marie would observe her family conducting the business that made the Medici name synonymous with power throughout Europe. She would sit quietly in corners of rooms where international politics were discussed with the same casual precision that other families might apply to planning dinner menus. She learned to listen for what wasn't being said, to notice when smiles failed to reach eyes, and to understand that in the world she was being prepared to enter, survival depended on anticipating threats before they fully materialized. Dinner itself was a theatrical performance where every aspect had been choreographed to reinforce Medici authority. The food served came from across the known world, each dish a reminder of the family's international reach and sophisticated taste. Conversations flowed seamlessly between languages as diplomats and scholars from across Europe gathered around tables laden with silver that had been crafted by the finest artisans money could command. Marie learned to participate in these conversations with a skill that amazed even experienced courtiers. She could discuss philosophy with papal nuncios, debate military strategy with condottieri, and analyze poetry with writers whose works were read in courts from London to Constantinople. But more importantly, she learned to do all of this while maintaining the appearance of feminine modesty that her society demanded, mastering the delicate art of wielding influence while appearing to defer to male authority. The gardens of the Palazzo Pitti became her laboratory for understanding human nature. As she walked among fountains and carefully manicured landscapes, she would encounter visitors from across Europe who had come to seek Medici favor or alliance. She learned to read their intentions through observation, noting how their posture changed when they thought they were unobserved, listening to conversations that revealed their true priorities and fears. These garden encounters taught her that politics was ultimately about understanding what motivated different people and how those motivations could be influenced or exploited. A German prince seeking marriage alliance might be driven by financial desperation, masked as romantic interest. A French diplomat might be more concerned with personal advancement than national policy. A papal representative might be pursuing private vendettas while claiming to serve divine will. As night fell over Florence, Marie would retire to her private chambers, where she would reflect on the day's lessons and prepare for the challenges that tomorrow would bring. She understood that her education was preparing her for something far greater than the traditional role of a noble wife, though the exact nature of that destiny remained unclear even to her sophisticated tutors. The books that lined her private study revealed the breadth of her intellectual preparation. Works of history taught her how previous rulers had gained and lost power. Philosophical treatises provided frameworks for understanding justice, authority, and the relationship between rulers and subjects. Religious texts from multiple traditions gave her insight into the spiritual beliefs that motivated different populations, and how those beliefs could be channeled toward political ends. But perhaps most revealing were the private letters and diplomatic reports that she was allowed to read, documents that provided unvarnished accounts of contemporary European politics. Through these papers, she learned that the glittering world of royal courts was built on foundations of constant negotiation, threat, and compromise. She discovered that even the most powerful monarchs lived with daily fears about succession, rebellion, and foreign invasion. The intelligence networks that brought this information to Florence were themselves marvels of Renaissance sophistication. Merchants, scholars, artists, and clergy all served as informal agents who gathered information about political developments across Europe. Marie learned to piece together these reports like a puzzle, understanding how seemingly unrelated events in distant kingdoms could ultimately affect Italian politics and Medici interests. This education in espionage would prove invaluable as Marie began to understand that information was the most precious currency in Renaissance Europe. She learned to cultivate her own sources among the servants and courtiers who moved freely between the great houses of Italy, gathering whispers and rumors that often proved more valuable than official diplomatic correspondence. A kitchen maid might overhear conversations about military preparations, while a seamstress could report on which noble families were ordering mourning clothes in anticipation of deaths that hadn't yet occurred. The winter months brought different rhythms to Marie's education, as the shortened days created more intimate settings for the most sensitive lessons. By candlelight in rooms warmed by massive fireplaces that consumed entire tree trunks, she would meet with her most trusted advisors to discuss matters too delicate for daylight conversations. These sessions taught her the arts of deception and misdirection that would become essential tools in her arsenal of power. She practiced the subtle craft of appearing to agree while actually committing to nothing, of making promises that could be interpreted multiple ways, and of delivering threats disguised as compliments. Her tutors would present her with hypothetical scenarios drawn from real diplomatic situations, challenging her to navigate complex negotiations where every word carried potentially fatal consequences for thousands of people. The mastery of emotional control became perhaps her greatest weapon. Marie learned to maintain perfect composure while receiving news that would have sent lesser nobles into fits of rage or despair. When messengers brought reports of military defeats, political betrayals, or family scandals, she trained herself to show only the reactions that would serve her strategic purposes. Genuine emotion became a luxury she could rarely afford, saved for the rarest moments of complete privacy. Her correspondence during these formative years reveals a young woman already thinking in terms that would have impressed seasoned diplomats. Letters to relatives across Europe were crafted with layers of meaning that allowed different readers to extract different messages depending on their level of access to Medici codes and ciphers. A single paragraph might appear to discuss fashion trends, while actually conveying intelligence about troop movements or marriage negotiations. The artistic patronage that surrounded Marie's upbringing wasn't merely cultural refinement, but another form of political education. She learned to commission works that would communicate messages to audiences who couldn't read, but could interpret symbolic imagery. A painting of a mythological scene might actually be a coded commentary on contemporary political events, while the choice of artists and subjects sent signals about the Medici family's alliances and aspirations. Musicians and poets who gathered in her chambers weren't simply entertainers, but sophisticated propagandists whose works would spread across Europe, carrying carefully crafted messages about Medici power and virtue. Marie learned to shape these cultural productions to serve her family's interests, while maintaining the appearance of disinterested patronage of the arts. The religious observances that punctuated her days provided another venue for political education. Marie attended masses where the congregations included diplomats and merchants from across the known world, and she learned to use these supposedly sacred occasions for intelligence gathering and relationship building. The confessional booth became a place where information could be exchanged under the protection of religious confidentiality, while charitable activities provided opportunities to build networks of loyalty among populations who might prove useful during times of crisis. Her confessor, carefully chosen for his political sophistication as well as his spiritual authority, taught her to navigate the complex relationship between religious duty and political necessity. She learned when pious action could serve strategic purposes and when pragmatic decisions might require seeking religious justification after the fact. This education in the practical applications of faith would prove essential when she later faced situations where religious and political considerations pulled in opposite directions. The seasonal celebrations that marked the Florentine calendar became elaborate rehearsals for the public performances that would define her later career. During Carnival, Marie learned to use masks and costumes not merely for entertainment, but as tools for conducting sensitive negotiations under cover of festival anonymity. Religious processions taught her how public ceremonies could be choreographed to demonstrate power while appearing to serve purely spiritual purposes. Wedding celebrations for relatives and allies provided opportunities to observe the intricate negotiations that preceded such unions, teaching Marie that marriage was the ultimate diplomatic tool in Renaissance politics. She learned to evaluate potential spouses not for their personal qualities, but for the political advantages their family connections might provide. Love, if it existed at all, was a luxury that could only be indulged if it happened to align with strategic necessity. The hunting expeditions that took the Medici court into the Tuscan countryside weren't simply recreational activities, but military exercises disguised as sport. Marie learned to read terrain with the eye of a general, understanding how geographical features could be exploited for defensive or offensive advantage. She practiced the skills of leadership by commanding groups of courtiers during these expeditions, learning to inspire loyalty and coordinate complex activities under challenging conditions. These outdoor adventures also provided opportunities for the most sensitive political discussions, as the open air and constant movement made eavesdropping nearly impossible. Some of the most crucial decisions affecting European politics were made during apparently casual conversations, while pursuing deer through ancient forests, with the sounds of hoofbeats and hunting horns masking words that could topple kingdoms. The medical knowledge that Marie acquired wasn't limited to the herbs and remedies that noble ladies traditionally studied. She learned to recognize the symptoms of various poisons, understand the effects of different drugs on human behavior, and master the preparation of substances that could heal or harm depending on dosage and application. This knowledge was presented as necessary for managing household health, but Marie understood its potential applications in the deadly games of court intrigue. Her study of different languages extended beyond mere communication to encompass the subtle cultural codes that governed behavior in various European courts. She learned that what constituted polite behavior in Florence might be considered aggressive in France, while actions that demonstrated strength in German courts could be interpreted as weakness in Spanish circles. This cultural fluency would prove invaluable when she later needed to navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. The financial education that Marie received from Medici banking experts taught her to think in terms of economic warfare long before military conflict became necessary. She learned how to manipulate currency exchange rates, control trade routes, and use debt as a weapon more effective than armies. The ledgers and account books that filled her private study contained lessons in power that no university could have provided. As she approached her 20th year, Marie had been transformed from a Florentine princess into something unprecedented in European history, a woman fully prepared to wield supreme political power with all the sophistication that such responsibility demanded. Her education had been completed not through formal graduation, but through the gradual assumption of real responsibility for Medici interests and decision-making. The letters that began arriving from French representatives in 1599 would put all of this preparation to the ultimate test, as Marie faced the prospect of leaving everything she had known to enter the most dangerous court in Europe as the wife of a king whose previous queen had died under mysterious circumstances. The teenage girl, who had learned politics through games and exercises, was about to discover whether her education had truly prepared her for the deadly realities of French royal power. The decision to accept King Henry IV's marriage proposal was not made in a single dramatic moment, but rather emerged through months of careful deliberation, conducted in chambers where the weight of European politics pressed down like incense-heavy air during Sunday Mass. Marie understood that this choice would determine not only her personal fate, but potentially the future balance of power between Catholic and Protestant forces across the continent. The French delegation that arrived in Florence during the autumn of 1599 came bearing gifts that spoke volumes about their king's intentions and expectations. The jewelry they presented wasn't merely ornamental but carried encoded messages about French royal traditions and the role Marie would be expected to fulfill. Each pearl and precious stone had been selected to communicate specific ideas about queenly virtue, while the craftsmanship itself demonstrated the level of artistic sophistication that characterized the French court. The marriage contract negotiations revealed the true complexity of what appeared to be a simple romantic union. Marie's dowry wasn't just money, but included trading rights that would affect commerce throughout the Mediterranean, political agreements that would influence papal policy for decades, and military commitments that could draw Florence into conflicts spanning from the Netherlands to the Ottoman frontier. Every clause had been crafted by legal experts who understood that royal marriages were essentially international treaties disguised as personal relationships. During these negotiations, Marie demonstrated the political acumen her education had developed. She insisted on maintaining certain Florentine customs within the French court, understanding that preserving elements of her original identity would provide her with psychological anchors during the inevitable periods of isolation and hostility she would face as a foreign queen. She negotiated for the right to bring specific advisors and servants whose loyalty to her personally exceeded their obligations to French interests. Most importantly, she secured agreements about her potential role as regent should circumstances require her to govern in place of future heirs who might be too young to rule. This provision, buried deep within legal documents that most observers dismissed as routine, would prove to be the foundation of her eventual rise to supreme power. Marie understood that queens who failed to plan for widowhood often found themselves powerless when their husbands died, regardless of their intelligence or political skills. The months of preparation that followed her acceptance of Henry's proposal transformed the Palazzo Pitti into a diplomatic headquarters where representatives from across Europe gathered to witness the creation of new alliances. Marie's wedding wasn't simply a personal celebration, but a geopolitical event that would reshape the balance of power between Catholic and Protestant nations, between French and Spanish interests, and between the old feudal order and the emerging modern state system. Her trousseau alone required the coordination of artisans from across Italy and beyond. The gowns she would wear weren't merely clothing, but diplomatic costumes designed to communicate messages about her taste, wealth, and cultural sophistication to French courtiers who would be evaluating her fitness to represent their nation. Each garment told a story about Italian artistic achievement, while incorporating French stylistic elements that demonstrated her willingness to adapt to her new homeland's traditions. The books that accompanied her to France revealed the intellectual foundation she would draw upon during her reign. Works of political philosophy provided frameworks for understanding royal authority, while historical chronicles offered examples of how previous queens had navigated similar challenges. Religious texts from both Catholic and Reformed traditions would help her manage the religious tensions that continued to divide French society, despite Henry's conversion to Catholicism. Her private correspondence during this period shows a young woman already thinking like a ruler, rather than simply a bride. Letters to relatives and allies across Europe established communication networks that would prove invaluable during future crises. She cultivated relationships with merchants and bankers who could provide intelligence about economic conditions and political developments throughout the continent, understanding that information would be her most valuable resource in an environment where she could trust no one completely. The journey from Florence to France became itself a diplomatic mission, as Marie's entourage stopped at courts throughout northern Italy and eastern France to meet with nobles whose support might prove crucial during difficult periods. These encounters weren't social visits, but carefully orchestrated political theatre designed to introduce Marie to potential allies, while demonstrating French royal power to populations who had never seen such magnificence. Each city that welcomed her procession had been selected for strategic reasons. Local nobles were evaluated as potential sources of support during future conflicts, while economic relationships were established that would provide alternative sources of funding should she ever find herself at odds with French treasury officials. Marie understood that queens who depended entirely on their husband's resources often discovered their vulnerability when political circumstances changed. The elaborate ceremonies that marked her progress through France served multiple purposes beyond simple celebration. They allowed her to observe French customs and social hierarchies, identifying which traditions she would need to respect and which might be modified to serve her purposes. More importantly, they provided opportunities for French nobles to evaluate their future queen, beginning the complex process of relationship building that would determine her effectiveness once she reached Versailles. Her first private meeting with Henry IV took place in a chateau outside Paris, where they could speak without the constant observation that would characterize their public interactions. This conversation revealed a monarch far more sophisticated than the popular image of a rough soldier king might suggest. Henry understood that his marriage to Marie was primarily political, but he also recognized that successful political marriages required genuine partnership between spouses who might need to trust each other during life-threatening crises. The king's candid discussion of French court politics provided Marie with intelligence that no amount of preparation could have supplied. He described the factional divisions that continued to threaten royal authority, identified nobles whose loyalty remained questionable despite their public protestations of devotion, and explained the financial pressures that limited his ability to reward supporters or punish enemies. This information would prove invaluable as Marie began to navigate the treacherous world of French royal politics. Henry's assessment of her capabilities revealed his hope that Marie would become more than a ceremonial queen. He needed a partner who could manage diplomatic relationships with Italian states, maintain connections with Catholic authorities who remained suspicious of his conversion, and potentially serve as regent if military campaigns or political crises required his absence from the capital. Marie's education had prepared her for exactly these responsibilities, though both she and Henry understood that theoretical knowledge would prove insufficient without practical experience. The wedding ceremony itself, celebrated at Lyon in December 1600, represented the culmination of months of planning that had involved not just French and Italian authorities, but diplomatic representatives from across Europe. The guest list read like a catalogue of continental power, with each invitation carrying political significance that extended far beyond social courtesy. Attendance at the ceremony signaled approval of the alliance, while absence communicated diplomatic messages that could affect international relationships for years to come. The religious service was conducted with careful attention to both Catholic and Reformed sensibilities, reflecting the religious complexity that continued to characterize French society. Marie's vows weren't simply personal promises. but political commitments that bound her to defend French interests, even when they might conflict with her Italian heritage or personal preferences. The ceremony marked her transformation from Medici princess to French queen, a change in identity that would require constant vigilance to maintain. The festivities that followed the wedding provided Marie with her first comprehensive introduction to the French nobility, whose cooperation would be essential for effective governance. Each conversation was simultaneously social pleasantry and political negotiation, as nobles sought to establish relationships with the new queen, while evaluating her potential as an ally or threat to their interests. Marie's responses revealed her understanding that every word would be analysed for indications of her political priorities and personal character. The gifts presented to the royal couple told stories about the diplomatic relationships that connected France to the broader European community. Italian city-states sent artworks that celebrated the cultural achievements of Marie's homeland, while demonstrating their continued friendship with French interests. German princes offered military equipment that suggested potential alliances in future conflicts, while Spanish representatives presented items that maintained diplomatic courtesy while revealing nothing about their true intentions. Marie's establishment of her household within the royal court required negotiations that were themselves political exercises. Her choice of ladies-in-waiting needed to balance personal loyalty with strategic advantage, selecting women whose family connections could provide intelligence and influence, while ensuring that none possessed sufficient power to threaten her position. Each appointment sent messages about her priorities and understanding of French social hierarchies. The apartments assigned to her within the royal palaces became centres of political activity, where she could conduct the business of queenship away from the constant observation that characterised public court life. These private spaces were decorated with artworks and furnishings that communicated messages about her taste and priorities to the constant stream of visitors who sought her favour or influence. Every element was chosen for its symbolic significance as well as its aesthetic appeal. Her daily routine as queen established patterns that would define her relationship with French political life for years to come. Morning audiences provided opportunities to hear petitions and dispense favours that built networks of loyalty throughout the kingdom. Afternoon consultations with advisors allowed her to gather intelligence about domestic and international developments that might affect royal policy. Evening entertainments served as diplomatic venues where sensitive negotiations could be conducted under cover of social activity. The birth of the future Louis XIII in 1601 transformed Marie's position within the French court from foreign bride to mother of the heir, providing her with new sources of influence while creating additional vulnerabilities. Her role in the prince's education would allow her to shape the future king's understanding of politics and governance, but it also made her a target for nobles who might prefer different approaches to royal authority. Motherhood brought both power and peril in equal measure. The elaborate christening ceremony for the Dauphin became another opportunity for diplomatic theatre, as representatives from across Europe gathered to witness the continuation of the Bourbon dynasty. Marie's management of these festivities demonstrated her growing sophistication in using ceremonial events to advance political objectives while maintaining the appearance of purely social celebration. Each detail was choreographed to send specific messages about French royal power and international relationships. Her correspondence during this period reveals increasing confidence in her ability to influence French policy through careful cultivation of relationships with key officials and nobles. Letters to Italian relatives maintained connections that could prove valuable during international crises, while communications with French administrators established her credentials as someone whose opinions deserved serious consideration on matters of state policy. The intelligence networks that Marie began developing during her early years as queen would eventually provide her with information superior to that available to many government officials. Servants, merchants, diplomats, and clergy all contributed pieces to the puzzle of European politics that she assembled in private chambers, where maps and documents covered tables like battle plans. Understanding the motivations and capabilities of foreign rulers became as important to her as managing domestic French politics. Her patronage of artists and writers wasn't merely cultural refinement, but another tool for political influence. The works she commissioned told stories about French royal virtue, while establishing connections with intellectual communities whose opinions could influence public perception of royal policy. Poets and painters became inadvertent propagandists, whose creations shaped how both French subjects and foreign observers understood the character and capabilities of their queen. The economic knowledge that Marie applied to her role as queen proved as valuable as her diplomatic and political skills. She understood how taxation policies affected different social groups, how trade relationships influenced international alliances, and how monetary policies could be used to reward friends while punishing enemies. Her input on financial matters demonstrated competence that surprised ministers who had assumed queens concerned themselves only with ceremonial responsibilities. The religious challenges that continued to divide French society provided Marie with opportunities to demonstrate her political sophistication while building relationships with Catholic authorities who remained influential throughout Europe. Her careful balance between supporting Catholic interests and maintaining the religious tolerance that Henry IV had established revealed understanding of the delicate compromises required for effective governance in a religiously divided nation. By 1610, Marie had transformed herself from foreign bride into an integral component of French royal authority, with relationships and capabilities that extended far beyond the traditional expectations of queenly behavior. Her preparation for the responsibilities that would soon fall to her was nearly complete, though she could not have anticipated that destiny would arrive through the blade of an assassin rather than the natural progression of royal succession. The morning of May 14th, 1610 began like any other in the royal apartments, with Marie stirring to the familiar sounds of servants moving through corridors lined with Flemish tapestries that caught the early light filtering through diamond-paned windows. She could not have known that before the sun reached its zenith, an assassin's knife would transform her from queen consort into the most powerful woman in Europe, thrust into a role that would test every skill she had spent decades perfecting. The news reached her through whispered words from her most trusted lady-in-waiting, who had received the terrible information from a palace guard, whose face bore the ashen pallor of someone who had witnessed history's violent turn. King Henry IV was dead, struck down by François Ravaillac, while his carriage moved through the crowded streets of Paris. The blade had found its mark with deadly precision, ending not just a life but an era, leaving France in the hands of a 9-year-old boy and the Italian woman who would now rule in his name. Marie's immediate response revealed the depth of her political preparation. Rather than collapsing into grief or panic as many expected, she moved with the calculated precision of someone who had always understood that this moment might arrive without warning. Her first actions were not emotional but strategic, designed to secure her position and maintain governmental stability during the crucial hours when news of the king's death would spread throughout the kingdom like wildfire through dry timber. Within moments of receiving confirmation of Henry's assassination, Marie had dispatched trusted messengers to key military commanders throughout France, each carrying identical letters that confirmed the continuity of royal authority under her regency. These communications had been prepared months earlier as contingency plans, demonstrating her understanding that successful rulers must always anticipate the unthinkable. The letters emphasized that governmental functions would continue uninterrupted, that existing policies would be maintained, and that any challenges to royal authority would be met with decisive force. Her transformation of the royal apartments into a command center revealed organizational capabilities that impressed even seasoned administrators, who had initially questioned whether a foreign-born queen possessed the skills necessary for effective governance. Maps appeared on tables that had previously held only decorative objects, while secretaries took positions at desks where correspondence could be drafted and dispatched with military efficiency. The ornate chambers that had served ceremonial purposes became the nerve center of French political power. The stream of officials, nobles, and foreign diplomats who sought audiences during those first critical days found themselves confronting a woman whose composure and decisiveness contrasted sharply with the chaos that many had expected to accompany such a dramatic transition. Marie received each visitor with careful attention to their individual concerns and capabilities, demonstrating her comprehensive understanding of the complex web of relationships that held French society together during times of crisis. Her management of the young Louis XIII during this period required extraordinary delicacy, as she needed to maintain his legitimacy as king, while exercising the practical authority of regency. The 9-year-old boy who had lost his father needed comfort and stability, but the kingdom required a ruler who could make difficult decisions without hesitation. Marie created elaborate ceremonies that honored Louis as monarch while establishing clear protocols for how governmental authority would actually function during his minority. The coronation arrangements she orchestrated for young Louis demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of political theatre and its role in maintaining royal legitimacy. Every aspect of the ceremony was designed to emphasize continuity with French traditions, while subtly establishing her own authority as regent. The guest lists, seating arrangements, and ceremonial protocols all served dual purposes of honoring the new king and introducing European observers to the reality of female political power exercised with unprecedented sophistication. Foreign diplomats who attended these ceremonies sent reports to their respective courts that revealed both surprise and grudging admiration for Marie's political capabilities. Venetian ambassadors noted her masterful handling of complex protocol issues that had the potential to create diplomatic incidents. Spanish representatives acknowledged her skillful management of religious ceremonies that satisfied Catholic expectations while maintaining the delicate religious balance that Henry IV had established. The financial challenges that confronted Marie during her early regency tested the economic knowledge she had acquired through years of study with Medici banking experts. France's treasury had been depleted by military campaigns and ambitious building projects, while tax collection systems remained inefficient and sometimes corrupt. Her reforms to governmental accounting procedures revealed both the scope of financial problems and her capacity to implement solutions that improved both revenue collection and administrative efficiency. Her private study sessions during this period took place in chambers illuminated by dozens of candles that cast dancing shadows across documents that contained information about every aspect of French governmental operations. She would spend hours each evening reviewing reports from provincial administrators, analyzing military expenditures, and studying diplomatic correspondence that provided intelligence about foreign intentions and capabilities. These solitary hours of concentrated work prepared her for the public performances of authority that defined her daily routine. The morning audiences she conducted became legendary for their efficiency and fairness, as petitioners discovered that the regent possessed both comprehensive knowledge of their concerns and the authority to provide meaningful responses. Merchants seeking resolution of trade disputes found themselves addressing someone who understood international commerce better than many officials whose entire careers had been devoted to such matters. Religious leaders discovered that their theological arguments were met with sophisticated counter-arguments drawn from extensive study of both Catholic and Reformed traditions. Her afternoon councils brought together the most experienced administrators in French government for discussions that revealed the breadth of challenges facing the kingdom and the sophistication of Marie's approach to addressing them. Military commanders found their strategic recommendations subjected to analysis that demonstrated genuine understanding of logistics, supply requirements, and tactical considerations. Financial ministers discovered that their budget proposals were examined with attention to detail that exceeded their own understanding of fiscal implications. The diplomatic receptions that filled her evenings provided opportunities for the most delicate aspects of international relations, as foreign representatives sought to understand how France's policies might change under female leadership, while Marie worked to maintain existing alliances and explore new diplomatic possibilities. These conversations required extraordinary skill, as each word was analyzed for indications of weakness or strength that could affect relationships between nations. Her private correspondence during this period reveals a woman operating simultaneously on multiple levels of political complexity. Letters to Italian relatives maintained family relationships while gathering intelligence about Habsburg military preparations and papal political intentions. Communications with German princes explored potential alliances while assessing the military balance between Catholic and Protestant forces. Messages to English representatives maintained diplomatic courtesy while probing for opportunities to influence British policy regarding continental European conflicts. The intelligence networks that Marie expanded during her regency created information-gathering capabilities that rivaled those of any European power. Merchants traveling between major cities carried messages and observations that provided early warning of political developments throughout the continent. Scholars and artists moving between courts gathered cultural intelligence that revealed the personalities and preferences of foreign rulers, whose cooperation might prove essential during future crises. Her management of French noble families required constant attention to the shifting alliances and personal ambitions that could either strengthen or threaten royal authority. The great houses of France each possessed regional power bases, military capabilities, and international connections that made them potential allies or dangerous enemies, depending on how their interests aligned with royal policy. Marie's approach to these relationships combined traditional rewards and punishments with innovative diplomatic techniques that had never before been applied to domestic French politics. The religious tensions that continued to simmer throughout French society provided Marie with both opportunities and challenges as she worked to maintain the delicate balance between Catholic and Protestant interests that Henry IV had established. Her own Catholic faith provided credibility with religious authorities, but her political pragmatism allowed her to continue policies of religious tolerance that served broader governmental interests even when they conflicted with theological preferences. The artistic patronage that flourished during Marie's regency wasn't merely cultural refinement, but served strategic purposes that enhanced both her personal reputation and French international prestige. The paintings, sculptures, and architectural projects she commissioned told stories about royal virtue and French cultural achievements that influenced how both domestic subjects and foreign observers understood the character of her government. Artists became inadvertent diplomats whose works carried political messages across international boundaries. The economic policies she implemented during this period demonstrated understanding of how governmental decisions affected different social groups and how those effects could be managed to build political support while improving overall national prosperity. Tax reforms that reduced burdens on farmers and artisans while ensuring adequate revenue for governmental operations revealed sophisticated grasp of fiscal policy that impressed even skeptical ministers who had initially questioned her qualifications for such responsibilities. Her approach to military affairs combined traditional French strategic thinking with innovative concepts drawn from her study of Italian military theorists and her observation of successful campaigns throughout Europe. The reforms she initiated in military organization, training, and supply systems improved French defensive capabilities while reducing costs that had previously strained the royal treasury beyond its capacity to sustain extended conflicts. The educational initiatives that Marie supported during her regency reflected her understanding that long-term political stability required populations capable of participating effectively in increasingly complex economic and social systems. The schools and universities she funded weren't merely charitable activities, but investments in human capabilities that would strengthen French society for generations to come. Her management of court life during this period balanced the ceremonial requirements that maintained royal dignity with the practical necessities of conducting governmental business efficiently. The elaborate rituals and entertainments that characterized daily palace routine served multiple purposes beyond simple display, providing venues for diplomatic negotiations, intelligence gathering, and relationship building that would have been impossible through formal governmental channels. The seasonal rhythms that structured Marie's regency reflected both French traditions and innovative approaches to governmental administration that maximized effectiveness while maintaining popular support. Winter months were devoted to intensive policy development and diplomatic planning, while summer campaigns allowed her to travel throughout France, building relationships with regional leaders and observing local conditions firsthand. Her personal routine during this demanding period required extraordinary physical and mental stamina, as she maintained schedules that would have exhausted much younger individuals. Dawn brought private prayer and meditation that provided spiritual preparation for challenges that tested both her faith and her political judgment. Morning hours were devoted to administrative work that required concentrated attention to complex details that could affect thousands of lives through seemingly minor decisions. Midday audiences provided opportunities for direct contact with French subjects whose concerns and complaints revealed the real-world effects of governmental policies. Afternoon consultations with advisors allowed for detailed discussion of issues too sensitive for larger meetings, while evening entertainment served diplomatic purposes that advanced French interests through cultural rather than military means. The physical demands of regency required Marie to maintain health and energy through careful attention to diet, exercise, and rest, despite pressures that made such self-care seem selfish. Her private physicians noted her remarkable resilience under stress that would have broken less prepared individuals, attributing her stamina to the comprehensive physical training she had received during her Florentine education. The emotional challenges of ruling alone tested psychological resources that Marie had been developing throughout her adult life. The isolation that accompanied supreme authority meant that she could trust no one completely, requiring her to make decisions that affected millions of people while bearing ultimate responsibility for outcomes that might not become apparent for years or decades. Her relationship with young Louis XIII during this period required extraordinary sensitivity, as she needed to prepare him for eventual assumption of royal authority while maintaining her own effectiveness as regent. The education she provided him combined traditional royal training with innovative approaches that reflected her understanding of how European political systems were evolving in response to new challenges and opportunities. The legacy that Marie began building during these early years of regency would establish precedents for female political authority that influenced European governmental development for centuries to come. Her demonstration that women could exercise supreme power effectively challenged assumptions about gender and political capability that had limited human potential throughout recorded history, while her specific achievements in diplomacy, administration, and military affairs provided concrete examples of how traditional limitations could be transcended through preparation, intelligence, and unwavering determination. The transformation that Marie underwent during her transition from queen consort to regent revealed capabilities that surprised even those who had known her longest and observed her most carefully. The young woman who had arrived in France as a foreign bride had become a ruler whose political sophistication exceeded that of most male contemporaries, proving that exceptional individuals could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through careful preparation and strategic vision. As her regency progressed through its first challenging years, Marie would face tests that would require every skill she had developed and every alliance she had built during her remarkable journey from Florentine princess to French ruler. The political and military crises that lay ahead would determine whether her unprecedented rise to power represented a temporary historical anomaly or the beginning of a new era in which traditional limitations on human potential could be transcended through exceptional individual achievement combined with favorable historical circumstances. The young mother who had assumed supreme authority over Europe's most powerful kingdom while maintaining the facade of serving her son's interests had already accomplished what no woman in European history had achieved. But her greatest challenges and most significant achievements still lay ahead, in the uncertain years that would test her abilities against forces that had destroyed previous rulers who possessed every traditional advantage except the intelligence, preparation, and strategic vision that had become Marie de Medici's most powerful weapons in the deadly game of Renaissance politics. Politics. The winter of 1612 brought with it the kind of bone-deep cold that penetrated even the thickest tapestries hanging in the royal apartments. And with it came challenges that would test every political lesson Marie had ever absorbed during her years of careful preparation. The Regent's Day began in darkness, as it had every morning since Henry's assassination, with the soft whisper of servants lighting fires in chambers where the breath of sleeping courtiers formed small clouds in the frigid air. Her morning routine had evolved into a ritual of power that began before dawn in private chambers, where no courtier was permitted to witness the transformation of a grieving widow into the most formidable political force in Europe. Marie would rise from a bed warmed by stones heated in kitchen fires, her feet finding slippers lined with ermine that had been gifts from Russian merchants seeking favorable trade agreements. The very act of dressing became a daily assertion of authority, as each garment was selected not for comfort, but for the message it would convey to the hundreds of observers who would scrutinize her appearance for signs of weakness or strength. The chemise of finest Flemish linen spoke of wealth that transcended mere royal allowances, while the stays that followed were reinforced with whalebone that had travelled from waters controlled by Dutch merchants whose loyalty could shift with political winds. Over these came layers of silk whose colours had been chosen by advisors who understood that fashion was simply another form of diplomatic communication, each shade carefully selected to influence the mood and expectations of those who would seek her favour throughout the coming day. Her jewels were chosen with the precision of a general selecting weapons for battle. The pearls adorning her throat came from waters off the Spanish coast, their very presence a reminder of the complex relationship between France and the Habsburg domains. The emeralds at her ears had been mined in territories controlled by German princes whose military support might prove essential if religious wars erupted again across Central Europe. Each precious stone carried political weight that extended far beyond mere decoration. The private oratory where Marie conducted her morning prayers had become a sanctuary where she could shed the mask of absolute composure that public life required. Here, surrounded by religious artwork that depicted saints who had endured persecution and martyrdom, she could acknowledge the fears and doubts that accompanied supreme authority while drawing spiritual strength for the challenges that each day inevitably brought. Her prayers were not merely ritual observances, but strategic consultations with divine authority that helped her navigate moral complexities that had no clear solutions. The letters that awaited her attention each morning arrived from across the known world, carried by messenger networks that rivaled those of any intelligence service. Correspondence from Italian city-states brought news of papal political maneuvering and Habsburg military preparations. Messages from German courts provided intelligence about Protestant military alliances and Catholic counter-movements. Reports from English representatives revealed the shifting calculations that governed British foreign policy regarding continental European conflicts. Each letter required careful analysis that went far beyond its surface content. Marie had learned to read between lines written by diplomats whose careers depended on conveying information while maintaining plausible deniability about sensitive intelligence. A casual mention of weather conditions might actually describe military preparations, while discussions of agricultural concerns could contain warnings about economic warfare designed to destabilize French trade relationships. The morning audiences that followed her private preparations transformed the ornate reception chambers into theatres where the business of governing Europe's most powerful kingdom was conducted with elaborate ceremony that masked deadly serious political calculations. The first petitioners of each day were carefully selected to establish the tone for subsequent proceedings, their concerns and requests chosen to demonstrate either royal mercy or royal authority, depending on the political messages Marie intended to communicate. Merchants seeking resolution of trade disputes found themselves addressing a woman whose understanding of international commerce exceeded that of many officials whose entire careers had been devoted to such matters. she could discuss fluctuations in grain prices that affected relationships with Baltic kingdoms, analyze the implications of monetary policies that influenced Italian banking, and evaluate the strategic importance of trading routes that connected France to markets from London to Constantinople. Provincial administrators who travelled to court seeking guidance or resources discovered that the regent possessed detailed knowledge of local conditions throughout the kingdom that often surpassed their own understanding of regional dynamics. She knew which noble families controlled key river crossings, understood how seasonal weather patterns affected agricultural production, and could predict how religious tensions might influence local political loyalties during times of crisis. Military commanders who requested audiences found their strategic recommendations subjected to analysis that demonstrated genuine comprehension of logistics, supply requirements, and tactical considerations that many professional soldiers had never fully grasped. Marie could evaluate the defensive capabilities of frontier fortifications, assess the reliability of mercenary companies available for hire, and understand how diplomatic relationships affected military alliance possibilities throughout Europe. The afternoon councils that brought together France's most experienced administrators revealed the sophisticated approach Marie had developed for managing governmental complexity that would have overwhelmed less prepared rulers. These meetings took place in chambers where maps covered every wall, their surfaces marked with coloured pins that indicated military positions, trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and intelligence sources that provided early warning of potential threats to French interests. The discussions that filled these council sessions ranged across every aspect of governmental responsibility, from the mundane details of tax collection procedures to the grand strategic questions that would determine France's position in the evolving European balance of power. Marie's participation in these conversations demonstrated her mastery of subjects that traditionally had been considered beyond female comprehension, while her questions revealed analytical capabilities that impressed even skeptical ministers who had initially questioned her qualifications for such responsibilities. Financial matters received particular attention during these sessions, as Marie applied the economic knowledge she had gained through years of study with Medici banking experts to the challenge of managing a royal treasury that had been depleted by military campaigns and ambitious construction projects. She understood how taxation policies affected different social groups, how monetary decisions influenced international trade relationships, and how fiscal discipline could be maintained without triggering the kind of popular unrest that had destroyed previous governments. The intelligence reports that formed the foundation of these policy discussions came from networks that Marie had been building since her earliest days as queen consort. Servants who worked in noble households throughout France provided information about aristocratic political discussions and family financial conditions. Merchants traveling between major cities carried observations about regional economic conditions and local political sentiments. Diplomats stationed in foreign courts sent coded messages about international developments that might affect French interests. Religious authorities, who maintained contacts throughout Catholic Europe, contributed intelligence about papal policy discussions and Habsburg political calculations. Protestant ministers whose congregations included influential merchants and administrators provided insights into Reformed community attitudes toward royal policies. Even artists and scholars moving between courts gathered cultural intelligence that revealed the personalities and preferences of foreign rulers, whose cooperation might prove essential during future crises. The evening entertainments that concluded each day served diplomatic purposes that were as important as the formal negotiations conducted during daylight hours. These gatherings brought together foreign representatives, French nobles, and international visitors in settings where sensitive discussions could take place under cover of social activity. The musicians who provided entertainment often carried messages between different political factions, while the poetry recitations included coded communications that only sophisticated audiences could fully understand. The elaborate dinners that accompanied these evening functions were themselves diplomatic exercises, where seating arrangements communicated political messages about royal favour and international relationships. The food served came from across the known world. each dish selected to demonstrate French wealth and cultural sophistication, while providing conversation topics that could facilitate relationship building between potential allies who might never have had opportunities to meet through formal governmental channels. The wines that flowed throughout these gatherings had been chosen not merely for their quality, but for their political significance. French vintages demonstrated domestic agricultural prosperity, while imported selections revealed the international trading relationships that connected the French court to markets throughout Europe and beyond. Even the choice of goblets carried symbolic weight, as vessels crafted by different artisans could honor specific regions or cultural traditions in ways that strengthened diplomatic bonds. The conversations that filled these evening hours required extraordinary skill from Marie, who needed to participate meaningfully in discussions ranging from theological philosophy to military strategy, while maintaining the careful balance between authority and femininity that her political position required. She could debate classical literature with papal nuncios, analyze economic theory with merchant princes, and discuss military tactics with professional soldiers, all while appearing to defer to male authority in ways that satisfied traditional expectations, without actually compromising her decision-making power. The private conferences that often followed these public entertainments took place in small chambers, where the most sensitive aspects of international relations could be addressed without the observation that characterized larger gatherings. These intimate meetings allowed Marie to explore diplomatic possibilities that were too delicate for formal negotiations, while building personal relationships with foreign representatives whose influence could prove crucial during future crises. The intelligence she gathered during these evening activities supplemented the formal reports that filled her morning correspondence, providing insights into personality dynamics and cultural factors that could not be conveyed through official diplomatic channels. Understanding whether a particular ambassador was motivated by personal ambition or genuine national loyalty could determine the success or failure of complex negotiations that affected relationships between kingdoms. The seasonal rhythms that structured court life during Marie's regency reflected both French traditions and innovative approaches to governmental administration that maximized political effectiveness while maintaining the ceremonial dignity that royal authority required. Winter months brought intensive policy development sessions, where major governmental initiatives were planned and diplomatic strategies were refined through detailed analysis of international conditions and domestic capabilities. Spring arrivals of foreign delegations transformed the court into a center of international diplomacy, where relationships between European powers were negotiated through elaborate ceremonies that combined political substance with cultural celebration. These events required months of preparation that involved not just French officials, but also representatives from across the continent who contributed to planning processes that ensured appropriate recognition of different national traditions and diplomatic protocols. Summer progresses through the French countryside allowed Marie to maintain direct contact with regional populations, while observing local conditions that could not be understood through written reports alone. These journeys served multiple purposes beyond simple royal visibility, providing opportunities for intelligence gathering, relationship building with provincial nobles, and assessment of military defensive capabilities that might prove crucial if external threats materialized. Autumn harvests brought economic assessments that informed fiscal planning for the coming year, as Marie reviewed agricultural production reports that affected both domestic food security and international trade relationships. These evaluations required understanding of how weather patterns, military conflicts, and diplomatic relationships influenced economic conditions throughout Europe and beyond. The personal toll of maintaining such demanding schedules while bearing ultimate responsibility for decisions that affected millions of people required Marie to develop extraordinary physical and psychological resilience. Her private chambers became refuges where she could temporarily set aside the mask of absolute composure that public life required, acknowledging the fears and doubts that accompanied supreme authority while drawing strength for the challenges that each new day inevitably brought. The relationship she maintained with young Louis XIII during this period required constant attention to the delicate balance between preparing him for eventual assumption of royal authority while maintaining her own effectiveness as regent. The education she provided him combined traditional royal training with innovative approaches that reflected her understanding of how European political systems were evolving in response to new challenges and opportunities that previous generations of rulers had never confronted. The tutors she selected for the young king were chosen not just for their scholarly qualifications, but for their political sophistication and personal loyalty to her regency government. These individuals understood that their primary responsibility extended beyond simple academic instruction to include shaping Louis's understanding of governmental complexity and international relationships that would define his future reign. The ceremonies that marked significant moments in Louis's development were orchestrated to serve dual purposes of honoring his position as king while reinforcing the practical authority that Marie exercised as regent. Each public appearance was carefully choreographed to demonstrate continuity with French royal traditions, while subtly establishing expectations about how authority would function during his minority. The military training that formed part of Louis's education reflected Marie's understanding that future French kings would need to combine traditional warrior virtues with sophisticated comprehension of evolving military technology and strategic thinking. The weapons masters and tactical instructors she employed were selected for their ability to teach both practical combat skills and theoretical knowledge of warfare that was becoming increasingly complex as European conflicts incorporated new technologies and organizational methods. By 1614, Marie had established governmental systems that functioned with efficiency that impressed even foreign observers, who had initially questioned whether female leadership could provide the stability that France required during such challenging times. Her administrative innovations had improved tax collection, enhanced military readiness, and strengthened diplomatic relationships throughout Europe, while maintaining domestic peace that allowed economic recovery from the disruptions that had followed Henry's assassination. The political coalition she had built during these years of regency included elements that had never before been successfully combined in French governmental history. Traditional Catholic authorities supported her policies, while reformed communities maintained their loyalty to a government that protected their religious freedoms. Merchant classes prospered under economic policies that encouraged trade, while noble families found their regional authority respected within a national framework that prevented the kind of aristocratic conflicts that had weakened previous regimes. The international reputation that Marie had developed during her years as regent reflected recognition throughout Europe that France had acquired leadership that combined traditional royal authority with innovative approaches to the challenges that confronted all European powers during this period of religious and political transformation. Foreign courts that had initially viewed her regency with suspicion now sought her alliance and counsel on matters that affected the broader continental balance of power. The artistic and cultural patronage that flourished during her regency wasn't merely decorative refinement, but served strategic purposes that enhanced French international prestige while providing employment for artists and intellectuals whose works carried political messages across international boundaries. The paintings, sculptures, and architectural projects she commissioned told stories about royal virtue and French cultural achievement that influenced how both domestic subjects and foreign observers understood the character of her government. The legacy that Marie was building through these years of unprecedented female rule would establish precedents that influenced European political development for centuries to come. Her demonstration that women could exercise supreme power effectively challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and political capability, while her specific achievements in diplomacy, administration, and military affairs provided concrete examples of how traditional limitations could be transcended through exceptional preparation and strategic vision. As her regency approached its most challenging phase, With Louis XIII reaching an age where questions about continued female authority would become increasingly difficult to manage, Marie faced the prospect of either voluntarily relinquishing power or finding ways to maintain influence that would not threaten her son's legitimacy as king. The choices she made during this crucial period would determine whether her remarkable achievements represented a temporary, historical anomaly or the foundation for lasting changes in how political authority could be exercised, regardless of traditional gender restrictions. The woman who had transformed herself from foreign bride into Europe's most powerful ruler understood that her greatest tests still lay ahead. As the political and military crises brewing throughout Europe would require every skill she had developed during her extraordinary journey from Florentine princess to French regent. Her preparation was nearly complete, but the ultimate validation of her unprecedented rise to power would come through her response to challenges that would test her abilities against forces that had destroyed previous rulers who possessed every traditional advantage except the intelligence, determination, and strategic vision that had become Marie de Medici's most formidable weapons in the deadly game of international politics. Idle weapons in the deadly game of international politics. The dawn of 1615 brought with it whispers that drifted through the palace corridors like morning mist, carrying rumors that would soon crystallize into the greatest crisis of Marie's regency. As she performed her daily ritual of transformation from private woman to public sovereign, the careful application of cosmetics that had become as essential as armor, she could not have known that powerful forces were already moving against her with the patience of master chess players positioning pieces for a decisive strike. The morning routine that had sustained her through 4 years of regency began as always in chambers, where candlelight danced across mirrors that reflected not just her physical appearance, but the weight of absolute authority that she had learned to wear as naturally as the ropes of pearls adorning her throat. Her ladies-in-waiting moved with practiced efficiency, their silence speaking volumes about the tension that had begun to permeate even the most intimate spaces of royal life. The correspondence that awaited her attention had taken on an increasingly urgent character, with coded messages from intelligence sources throughout Europe warning of military preparations whose purposes remained deliberately obscured. Letters from Italian relatives carried undertones of concern about Habsburg movements along the Alpine passes, while reports from German courts described religious tensions that seemed designed to mask political maneuvering that could threaten the delicate balance Marie had worked so carefully to maintain. The young Louis XIII, who appeared for his morning lessons, bore little resemblance to the grieving child she had comforted after his father's assassination. At 14, he possessed the lean build and restless energy of adolescence, but his eyes held depths that spoke of premature awareness of the complexities surrounding his position as king in name, while his mother wielded actual power. The tutoring sessions that had once been straightforward academic exercises had evolved into subtle negotiations where every discussion of history or philosophy carried implications about present governmental arrangements. His questions during these private meetings revealed an intelligence that both pleased and concerned Marie, as she recognized the same analytical capabilities that had served her so well now being applied to evaluation of her own authority. When he inquired about historical precedents for regency governments, she understood that he was not seeking academic knowledge, but rather exploring the boundaries of their current relationship. His interest in military strategy reflected not boyish fascination with warfare, but serious consideration of the forces he might someday need to command. The breakfast ritual that followed these educational sessions had become a careful choreography, where every gesture carried political significance that extended far beyond the immediate family circle. The food served spoke of prosperity and international connections, with delicacies from across Europe, demonstrating the diplomatic relationships that sustained French power. Yet the conversations that accompanied these meals required extraordinary delicacy, as Marie navigated between maternal affection and sovereign authority, while Louis tested the limits of both roles. The morning audiences that transformed her private apartments into centers of governmental activity brought a parade of petitioners whose requests revealed the complex pressures building throughout the kingdom. Provincial administrators reported increasing restlessness among noble families, who questioned whether female authority could provide the decisive leadership that France might need if international conflicts erupted. Military commanders described recruitment challenges that suggested popular confidence in royal leadership was beginning to waver despite the prosperity and peace that had characterized her regency. Merchants seeking resolution of trade disputes found themselves caught between loyalty to a government that had protected their interests and concerns about how foreign powers might exploit any perceived weakness in French leadership. Their carefully worded petitions revealed anxiety about economic relationships that could be disrupted if political instability undermined the international reputation that Marie had worked so diligently to establish. Religious authorities who had supported her policies of tolerance and moderation now brought warnings about extremist movements within both Catholic and Protestant communities that seemed designed to exploit any governmental vulnerability for their own purposes. These reports described underground networks that were spreading propaganda questioning the legitimacy of female rule while proposing alternative arrangements that could serve factional interests rather than national welfare. The intelligence briefings that concluded each morning's formal business painted an increasingly troubling picture of coordinated opposition that extended far beyond domestic French politics. Foreign powers that had initially accepted her regency as a temporary necessity were now exploring opportunities to exploit what they perceived as structural weaknesses in French governmental authority. Habsburg agents were reportedly establishing contact with disaffected French nobles who might be willing to support foreign intervention in exchange for enhanced regional autonomy. The afternoon councils that brought together her most trusted advisors had taken on the character of war planning sessions as Marie confronted the reality that her unprecedented achievements might soon face challenges that would require every skill she had developed during her remarkable rise to power. These meetings took place in chambers where maps covered with colored markers revealed the complex web of alliances and threats that connected French interests to developments throughout Europe and beyond. The financial reports that formed the foundation of these strategic discussions revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities in the governmental systems Marie had refined during her years as regent. Tax revenues had increased substantially through improved collection procedures and economic growth, providing resources that could support military preparations if defensive measures became necessary. However, the costs of maintaining adequate defensive capabilities while preserving the domestic prosperity that supported her popular legitimacy created fiscal pressures that limited her options during any extended crisis. Military assessments prepared by professional commanders who had served under Henry IV described French defensive capabilities with clinical precision that revealed both impressive strengths and concerning weaknesses. The reforms Marie had implemented had improved training, equipment, and organizational efficiency, while reducing costs that had previously strained the royal treasury. Yet these improvements had come at the expense of traditional arrangements that had bound noble families to royal service through personal loyalty rather than professional obligation. The diplomatic correspondence that occupied her evening hours revealed the delicate negotiations required to maintain international relationships while preparing for potential conflicts that could erupt without warning. Messages to Italian city-states emphasized continued friendship, while exploring possibilities for mutual defense against Habsburg expansion. Communications with German princes balanced religious solidarity with practical considerations about military cooperation during hypothetical future conflicts. Letters to English representatives maintained cordial relationships while probing for indications of British attitudes toward continental European conflicts that might affect French security interests. These diplomatic exchanges required extraordinary skill as Marie worked to gather intelligence about foreign intentions while avoiding commitments that could limit her flexibility during rapidly evolving political circumstances. The evening entertainments that had long served diplomatic purposes now took on additional significance as venues where foreign representatives could be observed and evaluated for signs of changing attitudes toward French leadership. The conversations that filled these gatherings required constant vigilance as Marie listened for subtle indications of shifting loyalties or emerging threats that might not be apparent through formal diplomatic channels. The musicians who provided entertainment during these social functions often carried messages between different political factions, while the poetry recitations included coded communications that revealed information about domestic opposition movements and their international connections. Even the choice of musical selections and literary themes conveyed political messages that sophisticated audiences could interpret as indicators of royal priorities and governmental confidence. The private conferences that followed these public events brought together the most sensitive aspects of intelligence analysis and strategic planning as Marie evaluated threats that were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from legitimate political discourse. The line between loyal opposition and treasonous conspiracy had become blurred as sophisticated opponents learned to cloak their activities in language of constitutional principle and governmental reform. The reports from informants embedded within various noble households described conversations that appeared to focus on abstract questions of governmental theory while actually exploring practical possibilities for coordinating resistance to regency authority. These intelligence sources revealed networks of communication that connected disaffected elements throughout France with foreign agents whose ultimate objectives remained deliberately obscured. The winter months of 1615 brought intensified activity as Marie's opponents prepared for what appeared to be a coordinated challenge to her authority that would test every defensive measure she had established during 4 years of careful preparation. The cold that penetrated even the most heavily fortified royal apartments seemed to carry with it an atmosphere of impending confrontation that affected everyone, from the highest nobles to the humblest servants who maintained the complex machinery of court life. Her personal routine during this period required extraordinary discipline, as she maintained the appearance of confident authority while privately preparing for challenges that could result in civil war or foreign intervention if mishandled. The morning prayers that began each day had become sessions of spiritual preparation for decisions that could affect not just her own fate, but the future of French civilization itself. The correspondence that filled her desk each morning brought increasingly urgent warnings from intelligence sources throughout Europe about military preparations whose timing suggested coordination among enemies who had previously operated independently. Habsburg forces were reportedly concentrating near French frontiers, while internal opposition movements accelerated their recruitment efforts among populations that had grown complacent during years of peace and prosperity. The young Louis XIII, who joined her for breakfast conversations, now demonstrated awareness of political tensions that he had previously ignored or failed to understand. His questions about governmental procedures and historical precedents revealed sophisticated comprehension of the challenges confronting the Regency, while his observations about court dynamics showed analytical capabilities that would have impressed experienced political observers. The relationship between mother and son had evolved into a complex partnership where traditional family affection coexisted with governmental calculations that neither could afford to ignore. Marie understood that Louis's eventual assumption of independent authority was inevitable, while he recognized that premature assertion of royal prerogatives could destabilize the kingdom during a period when unity was essential for national survival. The morning audiences that transformed private apartments into governmental headquarters brought petitioners whose requests increasingly reflected anxiety about political stability and international security. Merchants reported disruptions in trade relationships that suggested foreign powers were applying economic pressure designed to weaken French resolve. Military recruiters described difficulties in maintaining troop strength as potential soldiers questioned whether service to a regency government would provide the same security and advancement opportunities available under traditional male leadership. Provincial administrators who traveled to courts seeking guidance found themselves addressing concerns about local noble families whose loyalty had become questionable as opposition movements offered alternative sources of authority and patronage. These regional officials described situations where governmental effectiveness depended increasingly on personal relationships and individual competence rather than automatic respect for royal authority that previous generations had taken for granted. The intelligence networks that Marie had developed during her rise to power now provided warnings about threats that were becoming too numerous and sophisticated to address through conventional defensive measures. Agents embedded within opposition movements reported planning activities that suggested coordination between domestic enemies and foreign powers, whose intervention could transform political disagreements into existential threats to French independence and territorial integrity. The afternoon strategy sessions that brought together her most trusted advisors had evolved into comprehensive war planning exercises as Marie confronted the possibility that her remarkable achievements might soon face challenges that would require military rather than diplomatic solutions. These meetings took place in chambers where detailed maps revealed defensive positions and supply routes that could determine the outcome of conflicts that seemed increasingly inevitable, despite all efforts to preserve peace through negotiation and compromise. The financial preparations that occupied much of her attention during this period involved converting governmental resources into forms that could support extended military operations while maintaining the domestic prosperity that provided popular legitimacy for her continued authority. These calculations required balancing competing demands for resources that could either strengthen defensive capabilities or preserve the economic conditions that sustained political stability. The diplomatic initiatives that filled her evening hours involved increasingly complex negotiations designed to prevent foreign intervention, while preparing contingency plans for scenarios where such intervention became unavoidable. Messages to potential allies explored possibilities for mutual defense agreements, while communications with neutral powers sought to establish expectations about their responses to various conflict scenarios. The artistic and cultural activities that continued despite growing political tensions served strategic purposes that extended beyond simple morale maintenance or diplomatic courtesy. The paintings and architectural projects that Marie commissioned during this period told stories about royal virtue and French cultural achievements that were designed to influence both domestic and international opinion about the legitimacy and effectiveness of female political authority. The personal toll of maintaining such demanding schedules while bearing ultimate responsibility for decisions that could determine the fate of European civilization required Marie to draw upon reserves of physical and psychological strength that she had been building throughout her adult life. The private moments of reflection and prayer that punctuated each day provided spiritual resources that sustained her during challenges that would have overwhelmed less prepared individuals. The relationship she maintained with trusted servants and advisors had become a crucial source of emotional support that allowed her to acknowledge fears and doubts that public responsibility required her to conceal from all but the most intimate companions. These relationships provided both practical assistance and psychological stability that enabled her to function effectively despite pressures that increased daily as opposition forces accelerated their preparations for what appeared to be an inevitable confrontation. The young woman who had arrived in France as a foreign bride had been transformed by circumstances and personal determination into a ruler whose capabilities exceeded those of most male contemporaries. Yet she understood that her greatest tests lay immediately ahead as forces beyond her control prepared to challenge everything she had accomplished through intelligence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to French welfare and international stability. The spring of 1615 would bring with it storms that would test not just Marie's political skills, but the very foundations of the governmental systems she had built during years of unprecedented female authority in European politics. The choices she made during the coming months would determine whether her remarkable rise to power had established lasting precedents for human potential, or represented merely a temporary historical anomaly that would be swept away by forces too powerful for even exceptional individuals to overcome through intelligence and determination alone. As she prepared for challenges that would require every skill developed during her extraordinary journey from Florentine princess to French regent, Marie understood that the ultimate validation of her life's work would come through her response to enemies who possessed every traditional advantage except the strategic vision and political sophistication that had become her most formidable weapons in the deadly game of international politics that would soon determine the future of European civilization itself. The first signs of organized resistance emerged not through dramatic proclamations or military demonstrations, but in the subtle shift of morning conversations that drifted through palace corridors like smoke from dying embers. Marie noticed the change during her daily transformation ritual, as ladies-in-waiting who had once chatted freely about court gossip now exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of secrets too dangerous for casual discussion. The elaborate process of preparing for each day had become a meditation on power itself, as every choice from the pearls at her throat to the silk of her gown carried messages that would be analyzed by dozens of observers seeking signs of weakness or uncertainty. The Venetian glass that reflected her image each morning showed not just a woman approaching 40, but a ruler whose every expression had been trained to reveal nothing while suggesting everything. Her private chambers had evolved into command centers where intelligence flowed like water through carefully constructed channels, bringing news that painted an increasingly troubling picture of coordinated opposition. The reports that awaited her attention each dawn came from sources embedded throughout the nobility, their coded language describing conversations that danced around treason, while never quite crossing lines that would justify immediate action. The morning chocolate that had once provided simple pleasure now served as cover for meetings with intelligence coordinators, whose information revealed networks of communication stretching from Paris to Brussels to Madrid. These breakfast conferences required extraordinary discretion, as even trusted servants might carry loyalties that conflicted with their apparent devotion to royal service. The young Louis who joined these morning routines brought with him an awareness that had sharpened considerably during recent months, his questions about governmental procedures revealing understanding that both impressed and concerned his mother. Their conversations had evolved from educational exercises into strategic consultations where the future king's opinions carried weight that neither could afford to ignore. The formal audiences that transformed private apartments into theatres of royal authority now attracted petitioners whose requests carried undertones of political calculation that extended far beyond their surface concerns. Provincial nobles who had once sought simple administrative guidance now presented grievances that seemed designed to test royal responses to challenges that bordered on insubordination. Merchants whose prosperity had flourished under Marie's economic policies found themselves caught between gratitude for past favours and anxiety about future stability. Their carefully worded appeals for continued protection revealed growing pressure from competitors who whispered about opportunities that might emerge if political circumstances changed dramatically. Religious authorities who had supported policies of moderation and tolerance now brought warnings about extremist movements that seemed designed to exploit any governmental vulnerability for their own purposes. These reports described underground networks spreading propaganda that questioned fundamental assumptions about legitimate authority while proposing alternatives that would serve factional rather than national interests. The afternoon councils that had once focused on routine administrative matters now resembled military planning sessions, as Marie confronted evidence of opposition that had grown from scattered complaints into coordinated resistance. The maps that covered council chamber walls bore new markings, indicating noble estates where loyalty had become questionable and strategic positions where defensive measures might prove necessary. Financial assessments prepared by Treasury officials revealed the delicate balance between maintaining adequate resources for potential military action, while preserving the economic prosperity that provided popular legitimacy for continued regency authority. These calculations involved converting wealth into forms that could support extended conflicts while avoiding actions that might trigger the very instability they were designed to prevent. Military commanders who had served faithfully throughout her regency now brought reports of recruitment challenges that reflected growing questions about whether service to female authority could provide the same advancement opportunities available under traditional arrangements. These professional assessments describe capabilities that remained formidable, but faced pressures that could undermine effectiveness if political legitimacy came under sustained attack. The diplomatic correspondence that occupied her evening hours revealed international dimensions of domestic opposition that transformed what might have been internal political disputes into potential threats to national independence. Foreign powers that had initially accepted her regency as temporary necessity now explored opportunities to exploit what they perceived as structural weaknesses in French governmental arrangements. Messages from Habsburg representatives carried undertones of barely concealed satisfaction as they described their willingness to support whatever arrangements might best serve regional stability and religious orthodoxy. These diplomatic communications avoided explicit threats while making clear that powerful neighbors were prepared to intervene if circumstances warranted protective action. The evening entertainments that had long served as venues for informal diplomacy now required extraordinary vigilance as Marie listened for subtle indications of shifting loyalties among guests whose presence at court masked political calculations that could determine her fate. Conversations that appeared to focus on art and literature often contained coded discussions of governmental theory and constitutional precedents that revealed sophisticated opposition planning. Musicians whose performances had once provided simple pleasure now carried messages between different factions, their musical selections conveying political meanings that only initiated audiences could fully interpret. Poetry recitations that seemed to celebrate royal virtue actually explored themes of legitimate authority and governmental change that challenged fundamental assumptions about female political leadership. The private conferences that concluded each day brought together the most sensitive intelligence analysis as Marie evaluated threats that had evolved from amateur conspiracies into professional operations supported by resources that suggested foreign coordination. The quality of opposition planning revealed capabilities that exceeded anything domestic enemies could have developed independently. Reports from agents embedded within various noble households described conversations that maintained careful facades of loyalty, while exploring practical possibilities for coordinating resistance to regency authority. These intelligence sources revealed communication networks that connected disaffected elements throughout France, with foreign representatives whose ultimate objectives remained deliberately obscured behind layers of diplomatic courtesy and religious rhetoric. The winter deepened around the palace like a siege, bringing with it an atmosphere of impending confrontation that affected everyone from the highest courtiers to the servants who maintained the elaborate machinery of royal life. The very air seemed charged with tensions that made even routine activities feel like preparations for conflict that could erupt without warning. Her personal routine during these challenging months required extraordinary discipline, as Marie maintained appearances of confident authority while privately preparing for scenarios that could result in civil war or foreign intervention. The morning prayers that began each day had become sessions of spiritual preparation for decisions that might determine not just her own survival, but the future direction of European political development. The correspondence that accumulated on her desk brought increasingly urgent warnings from intelligence sources throughout the continent about military preparations, whose timing suggested coordination among enemies who had previously operated independently. These reports described troop movements and supply accumulations that appeared designed to support intervention scenarios that could transform political disagreements into existential threats. The young Louis, who shared breakfast conversations with his mother, now demonstrated awareness of political complexities that he had previously ignored or failed to comprehend. His observations about court dynamics revealed analytical capabilities that impressed experienced observers, while his questions about historical precedents showed sophisticated understanding of the challenges confronting Regency government. Their relationship had evolved into a partnership where maternal affection coexisted with governmental calculations that neither could afford to ignore completely. Marie understood that Louis's eventual assumption of independent authority was inevitable, while he recognized that premature assertion of royal prerogatives could destabilize the kingdom when unity was essential for national survival. The morning audiences that transformed private chambers into governmental headquarters brought visitors whose requests increasingly reflected anxiety about political stability and economic security. Trade representatives reported disruptions in commercial relationships that suggested foreign powers were applying pressure designed to weaken French resolve through economic rather than military means. Provincial administrators described situations where governmental effectiveness depended on personal relationships rather than automatic respect for royal authority that previous generations had taken for granted. These regional officials brought concerns about local noble families whose loyalty had become conditional on expectations about future political arrangements that might better serve their individual interests. The intelligence networks that Marie had cultivated during her rise to power now provided warnings about opposition activities that had grown too sophisticated and numerous to address through conventional diplomatic measures. Agents reported planning sessions that suggested coordination between domestic enemies and foreign powers, whose intervention could transform internal disputes into threats to French independence. The afternoon strategy meetings that brought together her most trusted advisors had evolved into comprehensive contingency planning exercises, as Marie confronted possibilities that her remarkable achievements might face challenges requiring military solutions rather than political negotiations. These sessions took place in chambers where detailed preparations revealed the scope of defensive measures that might become necessary. Financial preparations during this period involved complex calculations about converting governmental resources into forms that could support extended operations while maintaining domestic conditions that provided popular legitimacy for continued authority. These economic strategies required balancing competing demands that could either strengthen defensive capabilities or preserve political stability through continued prosperity. The diplomatic initiatives that filled evening hours involved increasingly delicate negotiations designed to prevent foreign intervention while preparing alternatives for scenarios where such intervention became unavoidable. Communications with potential allies explored mutual defense possibilities, while messages to neutral powers established expectations about their responses to various conflict developments. Cultural activities that continued despite growing tensions served purposes that extended beyond simple morale maintenance or ceremonial requirements. The artistic commissions that Marie approved during this period conveyed messages about royal virtue and French achievements that were designed to influence both domestic and international opinion about the legitimacy of female political authority. The personal demands of maintaining such intensive schedules while bearing ultimate responsibility for decisions that could affect European civilization required Marie to draw upon physical and psychological resources that she had been developing throughout her adult life. Private moments of reflection provided spiritual strength that sustained her during pressures that increased daily as opposition forces accelerated their preparations. The relationships she maintained with trusted companions had become crucial sources of support that allowed her to acknowledge fears and uncertainties that public responsibility required her to conceal from all but the most intimate confidants. These connections provided both practical assistance and emotional stability that enabled effective functioning despite challenges that would have overwhelmed less prepared individuals. The transformation that circumstances had wrought in the young woman who had arrived as a foreign bride now faced its ultimate test, as forces beyond her direct control prepared to challenge everything she had accomplished through intelligence, preparation, and commitment to French welfare. The skills she had developed during her extraordinary journey would soon be measured against enemies who possessed traditional advantages, but lacked the strategic vision that had become her most formidable weapon. The spring of 1615 approached like an army gathering on distant horizons, bringing with it the promise of conflicts that would determine whether her unprecedented rise to power represented lasting change in human possibility, or merely a temporary deviation that would be corrected by forces too powerful for individual achievement to overcome. The choices she would make during the coming confrontation would echo through European history for generations, establishing precedents that would influence political development long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. As dawn broke over a kingdom where ancient traditions wrestled with revolutionary possibilities, Marie understood that her greatest moment of testing lay immediately ahead. The teenage girl who had learned politics as a survival skill was about to discover whether exceptional preparation and unwavering determination could triumph over the combined forces of tradition, prejudice, and foreign intervention that now gathered against everything she had built during her remarkable reign as Europe's most powerful woman. The morning light that filtered through palace windows illuminated not just another day, but the beginning of a struggle that would determine the future of female political authority in European civilization. Every skill she had mastered, every alliance she had forged, every lesson she had absorbed during her extraordinary transformation would soon be tested by enemies who understood that defeating Marie de Medici meant destroying forever the dangerous precedent that exceptional women could wield supreme power as effectively as any man in European history. The fortress-like Louvre that served as Marie's primary residence during these crucial months had become a labyrinth of whispered conversations and meaningful silences, where even the most trusted servants moved with the cautious precision of people who understood that careless words could topple kingdoms. The massive stone walls that had protected French royalty for centuries now seemed to press inward with the weight of accumulated secrets and barely contained tensions that threatened to explode into open warfare. Her morning ritual had evolved into something resembling a military briefing disguised as feminine vanity, as each layer of clothing and jewelry was selected not for beauty, but for the political messages it would convey to observers whose loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. The crimson silk that adorned her shoulders spoke of royal blood and legitimate authority, while the diamonds at her throat caught the candlelight like fragments of ice, their cold brilliance reflecting the calculated composure she had learned to maintain even when facing existential threats. The private chapel where she conducted her dawn prayers had become a sanctuary where the mask of absolute confidence could briefly slip, allowing her to acknowledge the fears that accompanied supreme authority during times when that authority faced coordinated challenges from multiple directions simultaneously. The carved saints who gazed down from gilded alcoves had witnessed the prayers of countless rulers who had faced similar crises, their wooden expressions offering neither comfort nor condemnation to a woman whose unprecedented position in history left her without clear precedents for guidance. The intelligence reports that awaited her attention each morning arrived through networks so sophisticated that even experienced spy masters would have admired their complexity and reach. Letters written in invisible ink revealed conversations that had taken place in supposedly secure locations, while coded messages hidden within routine commercial correspondence described military preparations and diplomatic negotiations that could determine the fate of European civilization itself. A particular dispatch from her most trusted agent, embedded within the household of the Duke of Nevers, painted a troubling picture of coordination between domestic opponents and Habsburg representatives who had arrived in France under the guise of routine diplomatic business. The conversations described in this report revealed planning that extended far beyond simple political opposition, encompassing scenarios for foreign intervention that would transform internal French disputes into international conflicts with consequences that could reshape the entire continental balance of power. The breakfast chamber where she met with young Louis each morning had become a careful theatre where mother and son navigated the complex dynamics of shared authority while preparing for challenges that would test both their individual capabilities and their ability to function as an effective partnership. The 14-year-old king who joined these private conferences bore little resemblance to the grieving child she had comforted after his father's assassination, his questions revealing analytical sophistication that both impressed and concerned the woman who had shaped his education. Their conversations during these intimate morning hours required extraordinary delicacy as they discussed governmental matters that could determine not just their personal fates, but the future of French civilization itself. Louis's observations about court dynamics demonstrated understanding that extended far beyond his years, while his questions about historical precedents revealed awareness of the constitutional complexities that surrounded regency authority during periods of political instability. The elaborate breakfast service that accompanied these discussions provided cover for exchanges that would have been too dangerous to conduct in more public settings. Servants who had been carefully selected for their loyalty and discretion moved through the chamber with practiced efficiency, their presence creating an atmosphere of normalcy that masked conversations about defensive preparations and contingency planning that could soon become matters of life and death. The morning audiences that followed these private conferences transformed ornate reception chambers into theatres where the business of governing Europe's most powerful kingdom was conducted with ceremonial dignity that barely concealed the deadly serious calculations underlying every decision. The petitioners who sought royal favour during these formal sessions were themselves carefully evaluated as potential allies or enemies, their requests analysed for hidden meanings that might reveal the broader political currents flowing beneath the surface of court life. Provincial administrators who travelled great distances to seek guidance found themselves addressing a woman whose knowledge of regional conditions often exceeded their own understanding of local dynamics. Marie could discuss the defensive capabilities of frontier fortifications with military precision, analyze the economic implications of harvest failures with commercial sophistication, and evaluate the religious loyalties of different populations with theological insight that impressed even experienced clergy who had spent their lives studying such matters. Military commanders who requested private audiences discovered that their strategic recommendations were subjected to analysis that demonstrated genuine comprehension of logistics, supply requirements, and tactical considerations that many professional soldiers had never fully mastered. Her questions revealed understanding of how geographical features could be exploited for defensive advantage, how weather patterns affected campaign planning, and how diplomatic relationships influence military alliance possibilities throughout the complex web of European power politics. The afternoon councils that brought together France's most experienced administrators had evolved into intensive strategic planning sessions, where maps covered with coloured markers revealed the scope of preparations required to defend against challenges that could emerge from multiple directions simultaneously. These meetings took place in chambers where the accumulated wisdom of centuries of French governmental experience was applied to problems that had no historical precedents for guidance or resolution. The discussions that filled these council sessions ranged across every aspect of national defence and international relations, from the technical details of fortress construction to the grand strategic questions that would determine France's position in the evolving European balance of power. Marie's participation in these conversations demonstrated mastery of subjects that had traditionally been considered beyond female comprehension, while her analytical contributions revealed capabilities that impressed even skeptical ministers who had initially questioned her qualifications for such responsibilities. Financial reports prepared by Treasury officials revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of governmental systems that Marie had refined during her years of regency authority. Tax revenues had increased substantially through improved collection procedures and economic policies that encouraged commercial development, providing resources that could support defensive measures if external threats materialized into actual military conflicts requiring sustained resistance. However, the costs of maintaining adequate defensive capabilities while preserving the domestic prosperity that provided popular legitimacy for continued regency government created fiscal pressures that limited options during any extended crisis. These economic calculations required balancing competing demands that could either strengthen military readiness or maintain the social conditions that supported political stability through continued popular satisfaction with governmental performance. The intelligence briefings that concluded each afternoon's formal business painted increasingly troubling pictures of opposition activities that had evolved from amateur conspiracies into professional operations supported by resources and expertise that suggested foreign coordination and assistance. The quality of planning revealed in these reports indicated capabilities that domestic enemies could not have developed independently, while the timing of various activities suggested orchestration by experienced intelligence professionals who understood how to exploit weaknesses in even well-prepared defensive systems. Reports from agents embedded within various noble households described conversations that maintained careful facades of loyalty, while exploring practical possibilities for coordinating resistance to Regency authority during moments when such coordination might prove most effective. These intelligence sources revealed communication networks that connected disaffected elements throughout France with foreign representatives whose ultimate objectives remained deliberately obscured behind layers of diplomatic courtesy and religious rhetoric designed to provide plausible deniability. The evening entertainments that had long served as venues for informal diplomacy now required extraordinary vigilance as Marie navigated conversations that could contain coded discussions of governmental theory and constitutional precedents that challenged fundamental assumptions about legitimate political authority. Musicians whose performances had once provided simple aesthetic pleasure now carried messages between different factions, their musical selections conveying political meanings that only sophisticated audiences could fully interpret and understand. Poetry recitations that appeared to celebrate royal virtue and French cultural achievements actually explored themes of legitimate succession and governmental change that questioned whether female authority could provide the decisive leadership that France might require if international conflicts erupted across the continent. Even the choice of literary works performed during these gatherings carried symbolic significance that revealed the complex intellectual framework within which political opposition was being organized and justified. The private conferences that concluded each day brought together the most sensitive aspects of intelligence analysis and strategic planning as Marie evaluated threats that had grown too numerous and sophisticated to address through conventional diplomatic measures alone. The scope of opposition activities revealed in these classified briefings indicated coordination that extended far beyond domestic French politics, encompassing international networks that could transform internal disputes into existential threats to national independence and territorial integrity. The winter months of 1615 brought intensified activity as various opposition elements accelerated their preparations for what appeared to be a coordinated challenge to Regency authority that would test every defensive measure Marie had established during 4 years of careful political construction. The cold that penetrated even the most heavily fortified royal residences seemed to carry with it an atmosphere of impending confrontation that affected everyone from the highest courtiers to the humblest servants who maintained the complex administrative machinery of royal government. Her personal routine during this demanding period required extraordinary discipline as she maintained appearances of confident authority while privately preparing for scenarios that could result in civil war or foreign intervention if political challenges were mishandled or underestimated. The morning prayers that began each day had become sessions of spiritual preparation for decisions that could affect not just her own survival, but the future direction of European political development and the role of women in governmental authority. The correspondence that accumulated on her desk each morning brought increasingly urgent warnings from intelligence sources throughout the continent about military preparations whose timing and coordination suggested planning by organizations that possessed both the resources and expertise necessary to mount serious challenges to established governmental authority. These reports described troop movements and supply accumulations that appeared designed to support intervention scenarios that could transform political disagreements into military conflicts with international implications. The relationship she maintained with trusted advisors and intimate companions had become a crucial source of emotional support that allowed her to acknowledge the fears and uncertainties that public responsibility required her to conceal from all but the most confidential associates. These relationships provided both practical assistance in managing complex administrative responsibilities and psychological stability that enabled effective functioning despite pressures that increased daily as opposition forces accelerated their organizational activities. The personal toll of maintaining such intensive schedules while bearing ultimate responsibility for decisions that could determine the fate of European civilization required Marie to draw upon reserves of physical and psychological strength that she had been building throughout her adult life. Private moments of reflection and spiritual contemplation provided resources that sustained her during challenges that would have overwhelmed less prepared individuals. who lacked her unique combination of intellectual sophistication and practical political experience. The transformation that circumstances had wrought in the young woman who had arrived in France as a foreign bride now faced its ultimate validation as forces beyond her direct control prepared to test everything she had accomplished through intelligence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to French national interests and European political stability. The skills she had developed during her extraordinary journey from Florentine princess to French regent would soon be measured against enemies who possessed traditional advantages but lacked the strategic vision and political sophistication that had become her most formidable weapons. The spring of 1615 approached with the inevitability of changing seasons, bringing with it the promise of conflicts that would determine whether her unprecedented rise to power represented lasting change in human political possibility, or merely a temporary historical anomaly that would be corrected by forces too powerful for individual achievement to overcome, regardless of exceptional preparation and determination. The choices she would make during the coming confrontation would establish precedents that would influence European political development for generations, while determining her own place in the historical record of remarkable individuals who had challenged fundamental assumptions about human potential. As March winds began to stir the bare branches of trees that surrounded the palace grounds, Marie understood that her greatest moment of testing lay immediately ahead. The young woman, who had learned political survival through careful observation and strategic thinking, was about to discover whether exceptional preparation and unwavering determination could triumph over the combined forces of tradition, prejudice, and foreign intervention that now gathered against everything she had built during her remarkable tenure as Europe's most powerful female ruler. The elaborate court ceremonies that marked the approaching Easter season took on additional significance as both loyal supporters and potential enemies gathered to observe how the regent would handle traditional celebrations while managing political pressures that threatened to explode into open conflict at any moment. Every aspect of these religious observances required careful choreography that balanced spiritual obligations with political necessity. As Marie worked to maintain appearances of stability and confidence while preparing for challenges that could emerge without warning from multiple directions simultaneously, the young Louis who participated in these ceremonial activities demonstrated growing awareness of the complex dynamics surrounding his position as king in name, while his mother exercised actual governmental authority. His behavior during public appearances revealed sophisticated understanding of the symbolic importance of royal dignity, while his private conversations showed analytical capabilities that would prove essential if circumstances required him to assume independent leadership responsibilities sooner than originally anticipated. Their partnership had evolved into a complex relationship, where maternal affection coexisted with governmental calculations that neither could afford to ignore completely during this crucial period. Marie understood that Louis's eventual assumption of full royal authority was inevitable and perhaps imminent, while he recognized that premature assertion of independent prerogatives could destabilize the kingdom when unity and decisive leadership were essential for national survival against coordinated internal and external threats. The intelligence reports that continued to arrive through multiple channels painted an increasingly detailed picture of opposition planning that had reached levels of sophistication, indicating professional coordination and substantial financial support from sources that remained deliberately obscured. The activities described in these classified documents suggested preparation for scenarios that could transform political disagreements into military conflicts, with consequences extending far beyond French national boundaries to affect the entire European balance of power. As the final days of March dissolved into the uncertain promise of April, Marie de Medici prepared to face the greatest challenge of her extraordinary career, understanding that the outcome would determine not just her personal fate, but the future possibility of female political authority in European civilization. The young woman who had systematically transformed herself from powerless foreign bride into the most formidable ruler of her generation was about to discover whether intelligence, preparation, and strategic vision could overcome the combined forces of tradition and international conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything she had accomplished during her unprecedented rise to supreme power in the deadliest game of Renaissance politics. The morning of April 15th, 1615 arrived with deceptive tranquility, sunlight filtering through palace windows like liquid gold, while servants moved through corridors with the hushed efficiency of people who sensed that history itself was holding its breath. Marie's awakening followed the same ritual that had sustained her through 4 years of regency, yet every familiar gesture now carried the weight of potential finality, as if she were performing these acts of sovereignty for the last time. The silk chemise that touched her skin had been woven by artisans who understood that even intimate garments could carry political messages. Its threads, dyed with colors that spoke of prosperity and stability to those sophisticated enough to read such signals. Her corset, reinforced with whalebone that had traveled from Arctic waters controlled by Dutch merchants whose loyalty shifted with commercial winds, transformed her body into a statement of royal authority that could command respect even from enemies who questioned her right to wear a crown. The pearls that adorned her throat this morning were not chosen for their beauty, but for their origin in waters claimed by Spanish fleets, their lustrous surface reflecting candlelight, while simultaneously announcing France's complex relationship with Habsburg power. Each precious stone that followed served diplomatic purposes. Emeralds from territories controlled by German princes whose military support might prove essential. Diamonds from mines that connected her to trading networks spanning continents. Her private chapel had become a sanctuary where the accumulated weight of 4 years' decisions pressed down like incense-heavy air, where carved saints gazed from golden alcoves with expressions that offered neither comfort nor condemnation to a woman whose unprecedented authority had left her without historical models for guidance. The prayers she whispered in this sacred space acknowledged fears that public performance required her to suppress, while seeking divine strength for challenges that would test every skill she had developed during her remarkable transformation. The correspondence that awaited her attention arrived through networks so sophisticated that experienced intelligence professionals would have marveled at their reach and complexity. Letters written in sympathetic ink revealed conversations conducted in supposedly secure locations, while seemingly routine commercial documents contained coded warnings about military preparations that could reshape European civilization. A dispatch from her most trusted agent described coordination between domestic opponents and foreign representatives whose intervention plans had evolved from theoretical possibilities into operational preparations. The breakfast chamber where she met with Louis had transformed into a careful theatre where every gesture carried implications for the future of French royal authority. The 14-year-old king, who joined these morning conferences, possessed awareness that extended far beyond his years, his questions revealing analytical sophistication that both impressed and concerned the woman who had shaped his understanding of governmental complexity. Their conversations required extraordinary delicacy as they navigated shared responsibilities while preparing for scenarios where traditional arrangements might collapse without warning. Lewis's observations about court dynamics demonstrated comprehension of political subtleties that would have challenged experienced diplomats, while his inquiries about constitutional precedents showed understanding of the legal frameworks that governed regency authority during periods of crisis. The elaborate service that accompanied these discussions provided cover for exchanges too dangerous for public settings. Servants selected for absolute loyalty moved through the chamber with practiced discretion, creating atmospheres of normalcy that masked conversations about defensive preparations and succession planning that could determine the fate of European politics. The very porcelain from which they sipped chocolate carried symbolic weight, its delicate beauty contrasting with the harsh realities they discussed in whispered consultations. The morning audiences that followed transformed reception chambers into stages where the business of governing was conducted with ceremonial dignity that barely concealed deadly serious calculations underlying every decision. Provincial nobles who sought guidance found themselves evaluated not just as petitioners, but as potential allies or enemies whose regional influence could prove decisive if civil conflict erupted across the kingdom. Military commanders who requested private consultations discovered that their strategic recommendations underwent analysis, demonstrating genuine comprehension of logistics and tactical considerations that many professional soldiers never fully mastered. Marie could discuss fortress design with engineering precision, evaluate supply chain vulnerabilities with commercial sophistication, and assess diplomatic implications of military positioning with strategic insight that impressed even skeptical officers who had initially questioned female understanding of warfare. The intelligence briefings that punctuated these morning sessions revealed opposition activities that had evolved far beyond amateur conspiracies into professional operations, supported by resources indicating foreign coordination. Reports from agents embedded throughout the nobility described conversations maintaining facades of loyalty while exploring practical possibilities for coordinating resistance when circumstances might favor organized rebellion against regency authority. The afternoon councils that brought together France's most experienced administrators had become intensive war planning sessions, where colored markers on detailed maps revealed defensive preparations required to address challenges emerging from multiple directions simultaneously. These meetings occurred in chambers where centuries of governmental wisdom was applied to problems lacking historical precedents for resolution or even basic guidance. Financial assessments prepared by Treasury officials revealed the delicate balance between maintaining resources for potential military action while preserving economic conditions that provided popular legitimacy for continued regency government. These calculations involved converting wealth into forms supporting extended conflicts while avoiding measures that might trigger the very instability they were designed to prevent through careful preparation and strategic positioning. Military reports described French capabilities with clinical precision that revealed impressive strengths alongside concerning vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit if conflicts erupted beyond diplomatic resolution. The reforms Marie had implemented improved training and organizational efficiency while reducing costs. Yet these improvements had come at the expense of traditional arrangements, binding noble families to royal service through personal loyalty rather than professional obligation. The diplomatic correspondence that occupied her evening hours involved increasingly complex negotiations designed to prevent foreign intervention while preparing alternatives for scenarios where such intervention became unavoidable despite all efforts at peaceful resolution. Messages to Italian allies emphasized continued friendship while exploring mutual defense possibilities. Communications with German princes balanced religious solidarity with practical military cooperation considerations. Letters to English representatives maintained cordial relationships, while probing for indications of British attitudes toward continental conflicts that might affect French security interests in ways that could prove decisive if wider European war erupted from what appeared to be internal French political disagreements, but actually involved international conspiracy reaching the highest levels of European power. The evening entertainments that concluded each day served purposes extending far beyond ceremonial courtesy or social pleasure, providing venues where sensitive intelligence could be gathered through careful observation of guests whose presence masked political calculations that could determine her ultimate fate. Conversations appearing to focus on artistic and literary topics often contained coded discussions of constitutional theory and governmental precedents that challenged fundamental assumptions about legitimate authority. Musicians whose performances had once provided simple aesthetic pleasure now carried messages between different factions, their musical selections conveying political meanings that sophisticated audiences could interpret as indicators of shifting loyalties and emerging alliances. Poetry recitations celebrating royal virtue actually explored themes of succession and constitutional change that questioned whether female leadership could provide decisive guidance if international conflicts required rapid military response. The private conferences that concluded each day brought together the most classified intelligence analysis as Marie evaluated threats that had grown too numerous and sophisticated to address through conventional measures alone. Opposition planning revealed capabilities exceeding anything domestic enemies could develop independently, while coordination timing suggested orchestration by experienced professionals who understood how to exploit vulnerabilities in even well-prepared defensive systems. Her personal chambers during these crucial weeks had become command centers where intelligence flowed through carefully constructed networks, bringing information about noble household conversations, foreign diplomatic activities, and military preparations whose scope indicated planning for scenarios that could transform French internal politics into European international crisis, with consequences affecting the entire continental balance of power for generations. The physical demands of maintaining such intensive schedules while bearing ultimate responsibility for decisions affecting European civilization required Marie to draw upon reserves of strength developed throughout her adult preparation for exactly these circumstances. Private moments of spiritual reflection provided resources sustaining her during pressures that increased daily as opposition forces accelerated organizational activities designed to coordinate maximum impact when circumstances favored decisive action. The relationships she maintained with trusted advisors had become essential sources of support, allowing her to acknowledge uncertainties that public responsibility required her to conceal from all but the most confidential associates. These connections provided both practical assistance in managing complex administrative responsibilities and psychological stability, enabling effective functioning, despite challenges that would have overwhelmed less prepared individuals, lacking her unique combination of intellectual sophistication and practical political experience. The transformation that events had wrought in the young woman who arrived as foreign bride now faced ultimate validation as forces beyond direct control prepared to test everything accomplished through intelligence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to French interests. The skills developed during her extraordinary journey would soon be measured against enemies possessing traditional advantages, but lacking strategic vision that had become her most formidable weapon in deadly Renaissance political games. The late April days of 1615 brought increasing tension as various elements of organized opposition accelerated preparations for coordinated challenges to Regency authority that would test every defensive measure established during 4 years of careful political construction. The atmosphere throughout the palace had become electric with barely contained energy, as if everyone sensed that fundamental changes were approaching, with the inevitability of seasonal transitions. Her morning routine now included briefings from intelligence coordinators whose reports painted detailed pictures of noble households, where conversations had shifted from abstract theoretical discussions to practical planning sessions exploring specific scenarios for resistance coordination. These classified documents revealed communication networks connecting disaffected elements throughout France with foreign representatives, whose ultimate objectives remained deliberately obscured behind diplomatic courtesy and religious rhetoric. The young Louis, who participated in morning conferences, demonstrated growing sophistication in analyzing political complexities that would soon require decisive responses, regardless of their personal preferences or traditional expectations about royal succession timing. His questions about governmental procedures and historical precedents revealed understanding that circumstances might require him to assume independent leadership responsibilities sooner than originally anticipated by conventional succession planning. Their partnership had evolved into complex collaboration where maternal guidance coexisted with strategic calculations that neither could ignore during this critical period when unity and decisive action were essential for national survival against coordinated internal and external threats. Marie understood that Louis's assumption of full authority was inevitable and perhaps imminent, while he recognized that premature independence assertions could destabilize the kingdom when careful coordination was essential. The intelligence reports arriving through multiple channels described opposition activities reaching sophistication levels, indicating professional coordination and substantial financial support, from sources remaining deliberately concealed. Military preparations described in these classified briefings suggested scenarios that could transform political disagreements into armed conflicts, with consequences extending throughout European power relationships rather than remaining confined to French domestic politics. The morning audiences that transformed private chambers into governmental headquarters brought petitioners whose requests increasingly reflected anxiety about political stability and economic security during uncertain times. Trade representatives reported commercial relationship disruptions, suggesting foreign powers were applying economic pressure designed to weaken French resolve through financial rather than military means, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited if political instability undermined confidence in governmental effectiveness. Provincial administrators described situations where governmental authority depended increasingly on personal relationships rather than automatic respect for royal institutions that previous generations had accepted without question. These regional officials brought concerns about local noble families whose loyalty had become conditional on expectations about future political arrangements that might better serve their individual interests than continued support for regency government. The afternoon strategy sessions that brought together trusted advisors had evolved into comprehensive contingency planning exercises as Marie confronted possibilities that her achievements might face challenges requiring military solutions rather than diplomatic negotiations. These meetings occurred in chambers where detailed preparations revealed defensive measures that might become necessary if opposition coordination succeeded in creating crises that could not be resolved through conventional political means. Financial calculations during this period involved complex assessments about converting governmental resources into forms supporting extended operations while maintaining domestic conditions, providing popular legitimacy for continued authority. These economic strategies required balancing competing demands that could either strengthen defensive capabilities or preserve political stability through continued prosperity that had characterized her regency government since its inception. The diplomatic initiatives filling evening hours involved delicate negotiations designed to prevent foreign intervention, while preparing alternatives for scenarios where such intervention became unavoidable despite all preventive efforts. Communications with potential allies explored mutual defense agreements, while messages to neutral powers established expectations about their responses to various conflict developments that could emerge if internal French disputes escalated beyond peaceful resolution. Cultural activities continuing despite growing tensions served purposes extending beyond morale maintenance or ceremonial requirements, conveying messages about royal virtue and French achievements designed to influence both domestic and international opinion about the legitimacy and effectiveness of female political authority during challenging circumstances. The artistic commissions approved during this period told stories about governmental competence and national strength that could affect how both subjects and foreign observers evaluated French capabilities. The elaborate court ceremonies marking religious observances required careful choreography balancing spiritual obligations with political necessities. As Marie worked to maintain appearances of stability while preparing for challenges that could emerge without warning from multiple directions simultaneously. Every aspect of these traditional celebrations was analysed for symbolic significance that could influence popular opinion and foreign diplomatic calculations about French governmental effectiveness and political legitimacy. Her private study sessions during these demanding weeks occurred in chambers illuminated by dozens of candles, casting dancing shadows across documents containing information about every aspect of French governmental operations and international relationships. She spent hours each evening reviewing provincial reports, analysing military expenditures, and studying diplomatic correspondence, providing intelligence about foreign intentions and capabilities that could affect national security interests. The personal toll of maintaining such intensive responsibilities while bearing ultimate accountability for decisions that could determine European civilization's future required extraordinary physical and psychological resilience that she had been developing throughout her adult preparation for exactly these circumstances. The morning prayers beginning each day had become spiritual preparation sessions for choices that might affect not just personal survival, but lasting precedents for female political authority in European governmental systems. The correspondence accumulating on her desk brought increasingly urgent warnings from intelligence sources throughout the continent about military preparations whose timing and coordination suggested planning by organizations possessing resources and expertise necessary for mounting serious challenges to established governmental authority. These reports described activities appearing designed to support intervention scenarios that could transform internal disputes into international conflicts with far-reaching implications. The transformation circumstances had created in the young woman who arrived as foreign bride now approached its ultimate test as forces beyond direct control prepared to challenge everything accomplished through intelligence, preparation, and commitment to French welfare. The skills developed during her remarkable journey from Florentine princess to European ruler would soon face measurement against enemies possessing traditional advantages, but lacking the strategic sophistication that had become her most effective weapon. As May approached with the promise of spring warmth that could not dispel the chill of impending confrontation, Marie understood that her greatest challenge lay immediately ahead. The woman who had systematically transformed herself from powerless teenager into Europe's most formidable female ruler was about to discover whether exceptional preparation and unwavering determination could overcome the combined forces of tradition, prejudice, and international conspiracy that now gathered against everything she had built during her unprecedented rise to supreme political authority in the most dangerous game of Renaissance European politics. The seasons turned as they always had, but Marie de Medici had transformed from that foreign princess who stepped hesitantly into French court life into something unprecedented in European history. Through intelligence networks that spanned continents, diplomatic skills that impressed seasoned ambassadors, and political acumen that exceeded most male rulers of her era, she had proven that exceptional preparation could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Her legacy echoes through the centuries, not merely as a woman who briefly held power, but as someone who fundamentally altered how we understand political capability itself. The mourning rituals that began in Florentine chambers, the careful cultivation of allies across European courts, the masterful navigation of religious tensions and international crises. All of this demonstrated that leadership transcends traditional boundaries when combined with unwavering intelligence and strategic vision. Marie's story reminds us that history's most remarkable figures often emerge from the shadows of supposed powerlessness, transforming themselves through careful observation, relentless preparation, and the courage to seize moments when destiny calls. The young woman who learned politics as a survival skill became a master of the most complex political game ever played. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll carry with you the image of those candle-lit chambers, where a remarkable woman shaped the fate of nations through nothing more than intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon her extraordinary potential. Sweet dreams, and remember that even in the quietest moments, history's most powerful transformations are often taking shape in ways we never expect.